Hi, this is Paul. Let's have some fun with Scott Adams' Systemic Racist Challenge. I didn't hear about this until a couple of days ago. Someone who follows me on Twitter mentioned me with the @ on Twitter and basically said, what about Scott Adams' Systemic Racist Test? And I thought, I don't know anything about that. Well, apparently he issued a challenge on Twitter asking for someone to give him an example of systemic racism. Now, let's talk about Scott Adams, because I know a number of you watch Scott Adams, enjoy Scott Adams. I have seen some of his videos. I don't care much for a lot of political chatter, especially political scorekeeping. The Dems have done this, the Republicans have done that, yada, yada, yada. I have a fairly low tolerance for that, so I don't watch a lot of his videos. I first started tracking Scott Adams, and some of you who have watched my channel for a long time know that I've made a few videos about him, not a lot. I first noticed him after the Trump election because, well, he caught my attention on some of the things that he'd been writing. In some ways, well, stories sort of similar to mine in some ways. I mean, he's another balding white guy, quite a bit more successful than I am. He's the creator of the Dilbert cartoon, and after the Trump election, he was one of the few people that said, I think Trump is going to be elected. And he's had a very different take on Trump all the way along. And even if Trump loses the next election, in all likelihood, Scott Adams will say, I told you so. And I don't say that to say that he's disingenuous. He's very tricky. I'll say that about Scott Adams. He's very clever. He's very sly. And I'll talk a little bit more about this at the end of this video. I read his book on success, and I really liked it. I had noted early on that he had made some statements that were sort of like a dismissive materialist, which I found interesting. And I found his book very interesting. I found his book actually about success full of a ton of wisdom, and I have actually referenced his book to a number of young people who have come to me asking for career advice, because the kind of advice that Scott gives in those books, I think, is excellent for the most part in many ways. Okay, he's not a Christian at all. In fact, I think he's sort of a dismissive materialist, but has been evolving with some of the ways that he's thinking. So I might do another video or two on this, basically I watched this episode 1026 and was kind of going into it with a bias against the video, but really came out having a greater appreciation for Scott and what he's doing and a lot of his perspectives. I thought his perspectives were very helpful. He talked about David Chappelle's Netflix, little impromptu Netflix show that you can find on YouTube, and Sam Harris's podcast about the riots. And, actually I found Scott Adams to be quite even-handed with all of this. And so I very much appreciated that. And I actually agreed with a number of other things that he had said in the video. So, and I was actually, in preparation for making this video, I listened to the one that was released today and really had a similar experience with it. So someone, I forget who, recently had mentioned to me that Scott was putting out a lot of interesting stuff lately, and apparently he is. But it's typical Scott Adams. And again, a lot of I just have a low tolerance for that political stuff. It just sends my mind in a certain direction, which doesn't tend to be very helpful for me. Basically, his challenge is to explain systemic racism with a current example. That's his challenge. Now, there's something of this challenge that is a Crowder gotcha moment. Change my mind. There he sits with his, it's like that meme. And yeah, you can explain it to him. I didn't see him offering a cash reward or anything, but basically, send something up to me that I'll agree with and disagree with. And obviously, in terms of a rhetorical strategy, it's a little tricky. But now, the two main words that he's asking to be explained to him are both very fudgy words. The first is systemic, and the second is racism. And we should probably talk about both of them, because what has happened in our society is now that systemic racism has become a shibboleth. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, that's a story from the Old Testament where Israel is having a civil war, and a group of people can't say this word shibboleth the way the other group can. So basically at the ford of a river, they're trying to figure out who's who, and so they ask them to say the word, and you can tell from their accent what side of the civil war they're on, and so if you say the word wrong, you get killed. And that's what's happening with systemic racism. And so right now, both sides are lining up, fighting this war, yes or no, systemic racism. And everybody says their systemic racism exists is on the other side or on my side, and I'm going to cancel you or scold you or reject you or whatever based on where you stand with respect to systemic racism. And it's really it's just like that civil war in the book of Samuel. Late in the book of Samuel, it's the rise of David and the rise of David becoming king, if I'm remembering it correctly, and I don't always remember these things correctly. So we have to talk about both words. Let's talk about the word racism first. Now, I often recommend this piece by Scott Alexander. Scott Alexander is a pseudonym for a blogger who is a psychiatrist in a major East Coast metropolitan area, and he's sort of an honest and insightful lefty. Okay, so nobody's gonna argue that. Well, people are gonna argue all kinds of things, but he has a blog, Slate Star Codex, which is a very popular blog. He writes long articles, and in 2017 he wrote a particularly helpful piece that I found entitled Against Murderism, where he goes into basically what on earth do we mean by this word racism. And he starts with 3 definitions of racism. As usual, the answer is that racism is a confusing word that serves as a mishmash of unlike concepts. Here are some of the definitions people use for racism. Number 1, definitions by motives. An irrational feeling of hatred towards some race that causes someone to want to hurt or discriminate against them. Definition by motives. Let's call that motivational racism. She wants to stick it to white people or black people or Asian people or Hispanic people or men or women or tall people or short people or communists or Christians or Jews. She wants to stick it to a certain group of people because she hates them. Maybe she hates them because her father was one of these. I remember early on in Facebook land making a friend of a friend in Facebook who was very anti-racist. And the more I talked to this woman, the more I began to believe that a lot of her anti-racism was because she had married a black man and her parents were very much against it. Apparently her parents were very racist. Now, I don't know who her parents were. I can't judge her parents, but we all develop biases from our personal experiences in one place or another. If everyone who picked on you was of a certain racial background or ethnic background or language background or political background, you will develop a bias against these people. Now, he says this is an irrational feeling. I'm not so happy with that word, because if everyone who picked on you had this certain quality, then it is in fact rational to be a little cautious around that kind of person. Let's talk about biases against Nazis. If you're a Jewish person in the 1950s and most of your family was wiped out by the Holocaust, I'm not sure your bias against Nazis is irrational. It's very rational, but it's a bias, okay? And what we're looking at is what we call motives of a person. So she wants to stick it to this group of people, maybe defined by a race, maybe defined by a nationality. And again, it's helpful. For example, we're very sloppy in our language. When Trump talked about Mexican, Mexican is not a race like American is not a race, okay? Mexico is a multi-ethnic nation with all kinds of different people. And the irony is that whenever someone charges someone with racism against Mexicans, they themselves are being racist in a certain sort of way, because Mexican is not a race, just like American is not a race. Mexican is a nationality. And again, Mexico is a multi-ethnic nation. Pretty much everywhere in the Americas are multi-ethnic nations. There are descendants of indigenous peoples who were here when the Europeans got here. There are descendants of Africans who were brought here in slavery. There are descendants of Europeans and Asians who came here voluntarily, and Africans who came here voluntarily. So the Americas are all pretty much like that. Mexican is not a race. Mexican is a culture. Okay? So definition by motives, definition by belief. I'm going to call this propositional racism. A belief that some race has negative qualities or is inferior, especially if this is innate or genetic. We can flip this on its head. Populations who are from West African descent have greater immunity to malaria, which is part of the reason that racialized slavery happened the way it did in the American colonies. Okay? You might say that populations from West Africa have higher rates of sickle cell anemia. Apparently, the sickle cell anemia is the flip side of the greater immunity to malaria. Populations from different parts of the world have different innate and genetic qualities. Now, it's a difficult thing for us to comprehend, but it's a very obvious thing for us to comprehend. If I get out in the direct sunlight for long periods of time, I'm going to turn bright red, and my rates of skin cancer are higher because my skin is lighter. My eyes are more sensitive to light than people with dark eyes. I heard that by the eye doctor. Why is that? Why do people from northern climates that get less sunlight over time have lighter skin and lighter eyes? Well, it's because of the amount of sunlight that was in their habitat. Whereas people who are from populations that come from sunnier places have darker skin and darker eyes, again, because of the sun. Is this racism? Well, are these beliefs racist? This is going to get complicated, as you can see. Yet we bandy this word about as if it's simply evident and obvious to all. And the third, definition by consequences. Anything whose consequence is harm to minorities or promotion of white supremacy, regardless of whether or not this is intentional. Now, we're going to talk a lot more about this word intentional, because what we're doing here is separating motivation or intent from consequence. And we actually have a phrase, unintended consequence. Let's say the National Basketball Association is racist against short people, white people. I think there was, in Sacramento, there was one player from Israel, one Israeli player on the Sacramento Kings. He was good, but not a lot of Israelis in the NBA. A lot of black folks in the NBA. Does that mean the NBA is racist? You tell me. But these are the three definitions, okay? And what we're going to see is that because there are three definitions, this gets tricky. Because often what we do is we assert one and we slip in one of the others under the same word. Now, the Distributist, who is a YouTuber, did actually an excellent video on the Motte and Bailey switch, which is a common rhetorical move. And it's one of the most common moves you can see in this conversation. It basically goes like this. You cite examples of consequential racism, and then you impugn motivational racism. So the NBA is systemically racist because most of the players are black. Now, if you look at critical race theory, they undo that because only white people can have racism and not everybody else. The difficulty that you have is you've just redefined racism according, frankly, to all three definitions. You've given it a fourth definition, which it's fairly Kafkaesque, as many people have noted. Because if you acknowledge the racism, well, then you're a racist. If you deny the racism, you prove that you're a racist. So that's how that little game works. But the Motte and Bailey rhetorical tactic is a good thing to know about because it's easy to catch ourselves doing it. But again, if you think with a little bit more resolution about this word racism and three common ways that it's used, you can pretty easily see, okay, they've pointed to consequential racism and they've impugned motivational racism. But there's another little thing under here that you have to keep an eye on, which is motives of groups. Now, this is where we're going to get into the systemic question, because it's one thing to say little Sally grew up in a neighborhood where the majority of the people were of a different race, and little Sally got picked on because of her race, and it can go either way. I've seen it both ways. She got picked on because of the color of her hair or the color of her skin, and now grown up Sally hates this particular group because they picked on her. All right? But now you go to Sally's group and you say everyone in Sally's group has this, but now it depends on what is the nature of the group. And again, just a walk through John Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, talking about relevance realization, essence, group essence. What's the essence of a group? Well, do all white people have an essence? Does their group have an essence? Well, I guess the essence would be white skin. But again, the higher resolution you get on that, how white the skin. If someone is of African descent but is an albino and has no pigmentation in their skin, are they still black? And of course, there's the situation now, which is more and more common, that someone will say, well, you might have black skin, but because you don't have black politics, we're not going to consider you black, and on and on and on this little game goes. So not only is the impugning of motivation to individuals difficult, but the impugning of motivation to groups is exponentially more problematic. And you see this all the time. Now, Scott Alexander posted an example from 2017 that we're seeing in spades right now. A few days ago, Noah Smith posted on Twitter about hearing some people say racist things. The comments went like this: "These people are demented racists." By which definition? Yeah, and? Indeed, not sure they're within normal, nonviolent political means to deal with. So you're going to shoot people for being racist. No, not for being racist. Problem is, no, when normal politics fails, what then? Where does the U.S. go to deal with millions of armed loons? You see a lot of switching. So, in other words, racists have arms. Non-racists don't have arms. Again, this stuff is just sloppy. But it's not impossible to talk to people. And, you know, I feel... I don't know if I feel bad, but in all fairness, so the distributist uses Vaush as an example of Motte and Bailey tactics. I had a really lovely conversation with Vaush, so he's clearly capable of having a reasoned, civil conversation where both of us could talk to one another, understand each other, and not play little rhetorical tricks that undermines what you look for in a profitable conversation. Are both sides operating in good faith, as we like to say, and maybe coming to perhaps tentative common conclusions while not necessarily giving up some of the diversity of our own beliefs. Okay, so we talked about the word racism. Now let's talk about this word systemic. Now, I find this to be a tremendously ironic word for the creator of Dilbert to ask for examples of, because Well, if there's anything Dilbert has done, this is just the scrape from Wikipedia that Bing or Google cooked up. Dilbert portrays corporate culture as a Kafkaesque world of bureaucracy for its own sake. Notice motivation. Pay attention to that as we get into this. For its own sake, and office politics that stand in the way of productivity, where employee skills and efforts are not rewarded and busy work is praised. Okay? Scott Adams is an expert in examples of this. He has, in fact, created a very lucrative career giving experts of systemic blank. Systemic failure of almost every kind, which makes him particularly capable in talking about these things. So, who doesn't know, feel, and scoff at the crushing agentic power of a system? We see it in government bureaucracies. And again, this is a regular diet of the left, right, back and forth in our country. We think that the government should, like the government is really doing so well with blank. Is there something in the governmental ways, in the bureaucracies that happen when you scale up that just basically make the government ineffective at many things? Yes, it may be ineffective, but sometimes we're stuck with an ineffective system rather than no system at all. And this is the kind of thing we bump into all the time. And you'll see that in government, bureaucracy, schools. Right now, the left is so big on education. Schools educate poorly, and a lot of what they teach you is not what they are intending to teach you. And I say this as someone who homeschooled their children for a while. Let's be fair to both sides. Big business. I mean, talk about wasting money. Do you think governments waste money? Do you think big business wastes money on all sorts of things? It's just that since it's not taxpayer money, we don't worry as much. And again, this is part of the whole back and forth between all of these arguments that are so well known to most of you. Scott Adams doesn't understand this. Scott Adams understands systems better than most. And when he talks about, later in the video that I mentioned first off, he actually talks about systems fairly well, because he says, I got good advice from my mother, I got bad advice from my father. What advice did his father give him? His father told him, go work for the post office because you'll get good benefits. Well, why wouldn't Scott Adams want to work for the post office? Because it's a big bureaucracy that, actually they do fairly well delivering the mail at a fairly reasonable price, but I dare bet if you work for the post office, you are more aware than any of us of the idiot agentic power of that system. Okay, so now Scott followed up in a recent video, the video I was listening to this morning, and I think it's helpful to get a sense of what he's looking for someone to explain to me, as if Scott Adams doesn't understand how certain motivations, when they get into a bureaucratic system, can get absolutely counterproductive. Again, Adams has made a career pointing this out. And so when he says, I don't know what you mean by systemic racism. Really, Scott? I sense Lucy holding a football here, to mention another comic. Let's hear what Scott has to say.
Argument. So I've got 2 days left in my 1-week challenge for somebody to explain to me what systemic racism means with a current example.
Now notice how carefully he's being. Now he's not even giving away any money with this, but he's being pretty careful, which is pretty smart, because, well, what game is Scott playing? Doesn't want to be proven wrong, because when you're proven wrong, you lose a little bit of status. Now with a current example, and actually, at the end of the previous video with his little whiteboard. He really gave quite a nice example of systemic racism, frankly. But anyway, we'll go on.
Now, lots of people have explained to me what it means with examples of things that don't apply anymore, like laws that used to be the laws, etc.
Now, when you listen to this, try and mind read Scott and find out, okay, precisely what kind of an example of what are you looking for? We're going to practice a little bit of relevance realization here.
Tim Pool had an interesting definition, laws, etc. Tim Pool had an interesting definition, which I've never heard from anybody else. So I don't know how common it is. I can only say that I've never heard it before. And it goes like this. And I think there's a phrase here called going on tour, which refers to getting in a small amount of trouble, which you can't get out of, and it just magnifies the rest of your life. For example, let's say you got a traffic ticket, but you couldn't afford to pay it because you're poor and you're black. The poor part being more important than the black part. And so you don't pay your ticket, and then you get pulled over again, and now you've got an outstanding ticket. They take your license, but you still have to drive your car because that's the only way to get to work. And then the next time you get pulled over, now you've got tickets and no license. Now you go to jail, but you can't afford a lawyer. Now you've got a criminal record. So that by being poor, you can't extricate yourself from small problems because you can't even pay a fine. Now, I don't know how, so this, don't take too much from the specific example, but rather generalize it to the larger point that small troubles can be compounded over time, and that Tim Pool would like to define that as sort of a structural systemic racism. But it still doesn't pass the test of how does any other poor person get out of this. If you're poor and white...
See, now he's making the relevance realization argument, because he's saying quite correctly that the notable element here is the poverty. And so now we're using imaginary people, but a given white poor person and a given black poor person, well, he'll say it in a minute.
How do you pay your ticket? I mean, there's something terribly missing from this. Do the poor white people suddenly produce money out of nothing, and they can pay,
or produce money out of their whiteness?
Pay the ticket with having no money before they got stopped?
Now, it could be, again, and to play devil's advocate here, to argue, not really devil's advocate, but to argue the other side, if it is more difficult to get a job because you have language that sounds from you speak in terms of your subculture, and there are many subcultures around the United States. If you sound like you're Southern, if you sound like you're an immigrant, when people are hiring, they're often looking for a degree of familiarity. They're trying to match certain biases with other biases. In fact, we hire people to make decisions based on their biases, okay? We hire people for their biased filters. If you look for an HR, if you're looking for a headhunter, you're saying, I want you to hire people with X quality. Now, if there is, in fact, racism in the population, and people have certain experiences about what kinds of people they want to hire for a particular thing. Maybe, for example, in California, if you've noted that let's pull out a stereotype. Many of the landscapers are Hispanic. And I've watched those Hispanic landscapers work, and they work very hard. So I want to hire someone with a Spanish accent who speaks English with an accent, or their English gifts are limited. Now, this could very well be an example of racism. But it's an interesting example because you're basically connecting two different things, but because there's an association in your limited knowledge, you hire accordingly. You look around and say, well, in my experience, these immigrants from south of the border work hard, and maybe for less money, I will hire them And so you're giving preferential treatment to certain groups, and therefore, because you are giving preferential treatment to certain groups, you are biasing against other groups. Someone knocks on your door with a British accent wanting to cut your grass, and you say, no, I only hire people with Hispanic accents. I don't hire people with British accents to cut my lawn. Maybe if I need a good cup of tea, I'll invite you in and you can be my valet. I want a valet with an English accent, but I want a landscaper with a Mexican accent. I watched people hire Haitians for the same reason in the Dominican Republic, because there's this saying that went around, a Dominican will work when he's hungry, but a Haitian will still work even if he has food on the table. Now, this might get into not necessarily anything about Mexico or Haiti. It might in fact get into an immigrant dynamic. And again, this is part of the situation where there are systems, okay? And we draw conclusions based on biases. Let's say you were an Incan monarch, all right? And the Spanish have not yet come to North America, and you want a runner. Would you pick a lame person? No. Why? The quality that you are searching for is a capacity to run. That's why you pick. Now, are you biased against lame people for this job? Yes. Now, maybe if you want someone to sit and watch a well, or someone to sit and guard a plant and to call, or a house and to call out if there's trouble there, well, maybe you would want to hire a lame person, because the people with two good working legs walk away when they get bored or tired or want to do something else. But there sits the lame person. So again, relevance realization. And I think quite rightly here, Scott Adams points out that, well, this particular example isn't a great example, because the example has everything more to do with money than it has to do with skin color. Unless, and see, this is where things get tricky, how about when these things are piled up on top of each other? And we have this all the time. Let's say I'm going shopping for a car. If I roll into the Audi dealer and I'm already driving an Audi, I would argue that whether I'm black or whether I'm white, depending on how I'm dressed, I will get different treatment from the salesperson. Not different between black and white, but they are distinguishing based on the car I drive up in. If I've got some old beater American car and I'm not wearing nice clothes and I look like I don't have any money, no matter what color I am, well, they're going to treat me in a different way. And I've used the example before. Right now, I'm in very regular contact with two homeless individuals. One is white and one is black. The white man is banned from most of the stores around here. Why? Because he goes in there in various moods, various states of inebriation. He talks to customers in certain ways. He shoplifts. He does all sorts of things and regularly gets banned from all the stores in the neighborhood. The black individual who sleeps right next to him on the step here can go in any one of these places. Why? Well, because when he goes into them, he might smell a certain way, he might look a certain way, but for the most part, he's very well mannered, and he says please and thank you, and he has a particular demeanor that the shopkeepers and the store workers look at him and they say he's not a threat. So again, he's looking at the question of, okay, what is the relevant thing here? Now, I think he also has a bias in terms of what he's looking for in a system that is intentionally not colorblind. Well, what do I mean by that? There's something in the system that is not looking for color. A system that does not see color. Now, lots of systems we have don't see color. When you go to a soda machine and you put in the money to get a soda, the soda machine does not see color. The bank machine does not see color. Each of those systems sees dependent upon the relevance realization of what it is they are looking for. You put in your bank card, you put in your ATM card, and it looks at whether there is money in the account, and it will give you money based on whether there is money in your account. So you have a system that is seeing or looking for a particular thing in the world within its capacity to see things. Now we have to ask, do systems see anything? That question gets complicated pretty quickly because often people are working the systems. And again, people are hired for their biases. A security guard is hired to examine people when they come in the store. I was watching The Wire. I'm in season 4, and there's a particular storyline where there's a particular drug dealer, Mario, and Mario is kind of an up-and-coming drug dealer in the neighborhood, and he goes into a corner store, and this corner store was like Red's Corner Store on the corner of First and Jefferson Street in Paterson, New Jersey. Had all the plexiglass around, and I saw that growing up. And the owner of the store is black, and most of the workers are black. And Mario comes in the store, and he buys something, and he buys a bottle of water, and he pays for it. And there's a black security guard right there. And Mario looks at the security guard, takes some lollipops, puts it in his pocket right in front of the security guard. Why? Well, the security guard knows that Mario is a dangerous man and a thug, and afterwards, basically, the security guard goes out there and tells Mario, hey, I know what you're doing. Please don't do this to me. I'm just trying to do my job. And then afterwards, of course, Mario has his thugs go and kill the security guard. Why? Well, systems see things. Systems don't see anything. People who run systems see things. Systems are looking for whatever the system was designed to look for. And Scott's point here is an important one. For the most part, in America, after the Civil Rights Movement, the American government, in terms of its laws, have gotten rid of systems that see color. Basically, Jim Crow was legalized apartheid. And so part of the little trick that Scott Adams is playing here is that, can you find laws in America that are not colorblind? And if there are some of these laws, well, they will likely quickly be driven out of the legal corpus because, for the most part, in America, the consensus that has won the day has been laws should be color blind. That is the assumption of what a non-racist system is. But now, again, Scott is working on this question. Do you want to find an example of a system that is legally not colorblind? Well, read Douglas Murray's The Madness of Crowds. He goes into Harvard, and this is a very famous legal case where Harvard was biased against Asian American applicants trying to get more African American students into their college. And Asian Americans filed basically a court case, a lawsuit against Harvard. Harvard did not want to reveal what they were doing with respect to groups of applicants and ethnicity, and this has led to one of the great ironies, which many people love to point out, anti-racist systems that are racist, or racist systems that are anti-racist. Whichever way you want to work the sentence probably reveals which side of the divide that you're on. And Douglas Murray's book is a rather lovely walk through this in varying ways that demonstrate how often these kinds of remedies actually have the opposite results. Okay, we have motivational racism, we have propositional racism, and we have consequential racism. And he shows in many cases many systems that are designed to improve racial equity actually wind up doing the opposite, just in different things. In other words, the system is looking for something, but the consequences of the system are something else. Great example showed up on Twitter today. Unintended consequences. So we're going to defund the police to hire more teachers and social workers. Well, guess what the likely outcome of your effort is going to be? Look up, just Google sometime, the percentage of teachers in North America that are white women. Look up the percentage of social workers in North America that are white women. In other words, you're probably taking jobs away from probably some black men and men of other ethnic groups and giving those jobs to funding white women. And now again, in terms of systems, again, of which Scott Adams is an expert in, these kinds of systems have these kinds of consequences, and Scott Adams, better than just about anyone else, enjoys finding these kind of outcomes and lampooning them. That's basically the plot of Dilbert. Now, on a more serious note, again, if you listen to Loury and McWhorter, I try to listen to most of their conversations, but recently, again, with this in the news, I listened further, and it was a very excellent conversation. And they noted, well, one of the consequences of affirmative action is that, well, these systems actually go into, I think, forming and shaping people's motivational racism, often at a fairly low layer. So once people start to think that there is a different standard based on race so there's a lower standard for black students than there are for Asian students or for white students, well, suddenly, when you start looking around your classroom and you know this, you can't unthink this. So what does this mean? Well, you start making assumptions, racist assumptions, motivational, see, and even those three categories doesn't really get at all of them. You start making racist assumptions about the capacity of the students of color in your system. People do this. And Glenn Loury has done a number of programs on this because, if you're, let's say, a Supreme Court clerk, you're looking for the best student you can find. Well, how do you go about looking for the best student you can find? Well, you probably look at something like test scores, or you look at recommendations, or you look at all of these signals to try to find, well, what would be the best student I can find? What's to preserve the odds? And they've noted how often black students don't get the best clerkships because this other bias has worked its way into the system. Because you basically have a system that has said there's two standards, and so we can't have the same level of expectation about these students of color as we do about the white students. And in my previous video, I noted that ironically, once you create a bias against the white students that have to get in, have to perform at a higher level, the bias makes the disadvantaged group stronger. So what you've actually done is weakened the people that you are trying to help. Now, one of the really amazing things about this particular video with John McWhorter is that McWhorter said, hey, I got into grad school with these assumptions. Someone wanted to promote a person of color, and I wasn't up to snuff. And once I realized I wasn't up to snuff, and I was not in the same class as a lot of my white students around me, I got busy working on myself so that I could make the grade. And here again, so if you're trying to say, oh, look, affirmative action is a bad thing. Well, in this case, John McWhorter took the bad thing and turned it into a good thing. So These systems are very, very tricky things to do. A race test in the name of anti-racism sets up more bias in the population. In other words, these different aspects of racism work with one another, and in the hopes of fixing it, we often go about making things worse, which is basically a common story in human history. Pick up this story from the Washington Post a few years ago. White liberals dumb themselves down when they speak to black people, a new study contends. Why? Well, again, listen to John McWhorter, The Black Problem and the White Problem, because there's this well-intended non-color blindness that actually goes on to racialize and increase the problems in society. Now, there's a document floating around the internet that the person begins and says, I'm one of your colleagues at the University of California, Berkeley. How we would know this, I don't know. If we're going to be skeptical of one side, let's be skeptical of the other side. I have met you both personally, but do not know you closely, and I am contacting you anonymously with apologies. I am worried that writing this email publicly, he might lose status. And what he basically goes on to do is basically make the argument that lots of people know, and what this is a basic treatise of a variety of arguments that have made these points all along. And if you haven't read this thing, take a look at it. I'll put the link below in the show notes. And it basically says what all these systems are saying is that black people are dumber than white people. And okay, some people might get better jobs because of it, and they're going to have to suck it up, but these racist programs in the name of anti-racism just, in fact, in many cases, create more bias, which is going to produce more racism. The other aspect I want to get at with Scott here is that a system that is intentionally not colorblind, do systems exhibit intentionality? Well, now we're starting to talk about a bunch of the other things we talk about. To what degree does Dilbert feel like the system is against him? If you listen to that line recently, you'll hear it a lot. I can't help but feel that society is against me, or the government is against me, or the corporation that I work for is against me. A system that exhibits intentionality of its creator. In fact, does there have to be a living human being somewhere early on that created the system to achieve this particular outcome? Well, that's usually why people create systems, but very quickly systems grow and get beyond them, and as we often say, take on a life of their own. A system that appears to human beings to have intentionality. It's sort of a Turing test with respect to systems. Now, again, I've been watching The Wire recently and really enjoying it. It came out in the early 2000s, right after 9/11, and ended in 2008. And what The Wire basically illustrates is this: how the police system, where they're trying to solve all these cases. Well, how do you hold people accountable to solve all these murder cases? Well, you promote them when they solve the murder cases. Well, what do you do? Well, what you actually do in systems like that is you de-incentivize good work. And the thing that underlies the entire series is that policing, education, many of these systems basically wind up going against what everyone assumes the system should be about. And people get corrupted by the systems because you're rewarded at least in the Baltimore Police Department. You're rewarded for doing all of these things that are dramatically shown in the context of the TV series to not exactly address the thing that they're supposed to address. And I think, based on what I've seen, that The Wire it's a bit gratuitous in times with some elements that, some sexual elements and some violence elements. It's an HBO series that many of you will find objectionable and repulsive, and sometimes those elements are in fact gratuitous. I think that's part of HBO's shtick. But The Wire portrays with excellence the kinds of traps that we find. The power that these traps have to create systems. Well, for example, in one of the episodes I watched last night, here's the son. His father is in jail for being a soldier with one of the drug outfits, and the mother has been basically driving in BMW and getting plenty of money from the drug lord's family, but now all the drug lords are in jail, and so there's no money coming in, so she gets cut off, and so she tells her son, who is an 8th grader, to go out there into the streets and start making money so she can continue to live the lifestyle according to which she has grown accustomed. And The Wire is just a study again and again and again of this, and we see it in the black community, we see it in the white community, you see it in various ethnic groups within the white community, you see it with the Polish community, you see it with the Italian community, you see it with the Irish community, on and on and on and on, and we see many people who are doing their level best to try and make the world a better place, but the system is bringing them down. And, well, this was common knowledge in at least up to 2008, and I don't know if The Wire could be produced today. Can we talk about intentionality with systems? Now, again, those of you who've been watching my channel for a while know this gets into a lot of things that we have talked about quite a bit. In fact, my ongoing conversation with John Vervaeke has everything to do with whether or not systems built on impersonal things can begin to act like people, and act like people exhibiting something that to us, again, this is sort of the intentionality Turing test, that looks to us like intentionality. Well, I think the NBA is racist because look at all those black players. Now, I personally believe that the number of black players in the NBA is not a function of the racism in the upper management of the NBA. Maybe there is racism in the upper management of the NBA, but in many ways, sports looks at particular qualities. It's about as pure a meritocracy as we have. But then again, talk to just about anybody who's had experience in professional sports, and they will tell you how non-meritocratic the system actually is, even though we've got statistics and everything. So we treat systems as if they are people, as if they have intentionality, as if the system can be racist. But what do we mean by racist? Usually we mean consequentialist, but I think often we mean it feels racist to me because I believe that this is a result of my race. Now, when I lived in the Dominican Republic, I lived as a very pale skin, someone with a very thick American accent, speaking Spanish, because I learned Spanish after I was 25, a very thick American accent, driving a car, wearing North American clothing. Now, part of the reality of life in many places in the Dominican Republic is that if you go into a market, let's say, prices are negotiated. Do you think I paid higher prices than other Dominicans? Scott Adams, are you looking for an example? I'd call that systemic racism. Why? Because They discriminated against me because they looked at my clothing, they looked at my skin color, they looked at the fact that I drove a car, they looked at the house that I lived in and thought, this guy can pay more and he's an idiot when it comes to negotiation. He doesn't know how much anything in this market should cost. Systemic racism, right there. Now, is it a particularly irksome kind? Well, I sort of assumed it. We would go into a restaurant and we would wonder if we had bad service, always lurking in the back of our mind. Is the bad service because we're gringos? Often it worked the other way, and I gave the example of, I should probably tell the whole story. I think I used the example on Twitter. So I was working with Haitians. Haitians were, for the most part, undocumented. They often worked for the government sugarcane organization in the Dominican Republic. In the area that I worked in, they were spent the season of cane cutting down in the valley and the season of coffee picking up in the mountains. And they usually kind of patch together a livelihood, cutting sugarcane, picking coffee, and with their garden. Well, in order to get to these places, you had to travel on the roads, and on these roads, the highly defunded police basically stood by the side of the roads, flagging cars down, looking for tips. And in fact, the president of the Dominican Republic, the one who followed the dictator, Balaguer, once told the police and the army, we know we don't pay you more, we know we don't pay you much, and you'll have to make it up on tips. Well, I'll tell you, if you have a system where law enforcement is taking tips, you are not going to get socioeconomic blindness in terms of justice from the police or the soldiers. And I lived in a town not too far from the Haitian border, so there are a lot of soldiers manning checkpoints on the roads. So this one particular day, a Haitian who was picking coffee, working sugarcane, didn't have legal documentation in the Dominican Republic. This Haitian was traveling, and this particular Haitian had saved up his money, and he had bought a camera. And the guagua, the bus that was traveling down the little highway, got stopped by a military checkpoint. Soldiers went on. A soldier looked at the color of this Haitian's skin, could listen to his Haitian accent in Spanish, saw he had a camera, took the camera. Okay, what does this Haitian do who is now out a camera? Something that probably for some of us would be equal to the lifestyle hit that perhaps buying a car would have for one of us. This is a very big item for this individual. Well, this individual goes to church, and this individual goes to church with a relationship with someone with white skin. So the individual goes to his preacher in the local chapter. The preacher goes to the pastor, who has a personal relationship with me. Knock, knock, knock on the door of my house. Missionary, could you come out here? We've had some trouble. What's the trouble? Well, one of our church members went through a military checkpoint, and one of the soldiers took his camera. Okay, so I dress up a little bit better. I don't have to do any makeup to get any whiter. I climb into my vehicle. I bring the guy who lost his camera, the preacher, and the pastor, and I go to the military base here in Sacramento. And I go to the base, and let me tell you, if it were the pastor and the preacher and the Haitian, all three having very dark skin, they wouldn't have even tried to get into that military base. But because here am I, glorious white skin and American accent, they let me right into the base. And the commander comes out and says, can I help you with anything? Because there's always a little pressure on the Dominican Republic because of their treatment of Haitians from the United States. And I say, yeah. One of the members of our church had his camera taken by a soldier who was running a checkpoint in such and such a place. All right. And so what does the commander do? Calls up someone who was running what outfit, what unit was running the checkpoint. Okay. So I'm standing there with the pastor and the preacher and the guy who lost his camera. Out comes all of the soldiers, lines them all up. The commander makes a very good show of it and says to me, if any of you took this man's camera, you'd better bring it out right now or you're going to be in big trouble. Most of us have seen this routine in school. First, nobody moves. Then nobody moves. And then he doubled down on the threats. And sure enough, the soldier who took it cracked, went and got the camera. The camera was restored to the Haitian. Justice is served. And it was. And then the commander leans over to me and says, basically the commander had said, if you give up the camera now, you won't be punished. But if you wait, you will be punished. See how poorly I told this story? So then the commander leans over to me and says, I'm going to punish him anyway. Whether he did or didn't, I have no idea. But this is how systems work. Does a system have to be legal for it to be systemically racist? No. Here's an example of systemic racism that I dealt with all the time. I'm under no illusions that these systems can't be racist, but again, pay attention to the part of the conversation we're looking at. This system has taken on what looks to us like intentionality. We act as if that system is like a person. And in fact, we complain to the system as if we would complain to a person. The entire dynamic is full of intentionality. We complain about systems as if they had agency, and we use that language because it fits best. And all of these ideas of emergence. So let's say if you're a physicalist that believes that even what we call agency in human beings is all built from the bottom up, well, then all of our agencies are built from the bottom up. And by all means, systems can be racist. The video I just did recently, humans appropriate all truth metaphorically and process it personally. Myths are storified principalities and powers. We think far larger and more powerful than school spirit, which is the example that I've given. There's such a thing as school spirit. All of us know it. Again, season 4 of The Wire, they're spending a lot of time in a school with some 8th graders. Well, that school has a variety of spirits that is dominating, and in fact, the retired police officer, the university professor who is doing a study on violence in the inner city, the one police officer that shot a cop, a black cop, and so left the police force, now goes into the school and is going to teach math to 8th graders. Systemic racism? Of course systems can be racist. It doesn't have to be written into the code. The code doesn't have to be... the code can be colorblind, the intent can be colorblind, but the consequences are otherwise. Racism as a principality is systemic and personal in this way of it being personal. It's spiritual. And again, this tracks very much with Christian ideas about sin. Sin is something that takes us captive, and we need a stronger spirit to address it. Now, what I find is that secularists are commonly naive in terms of their remedies. And people ask me, again, we have a shibboleth. Is there systemic racism? Of course. We have systemic all kinds of things. In fact, human beings are systemic. And in some ways, the motivational racism in human beings is not that different from the motivational racism that can happen in police forces. Because if here's a human being, grows up, and everyone says, you know what the key feature to X sin is? The key identifier is the color of their skin or the accent on their language. You tune an entire system to that thing. Do you think that construction crews in California don't prioritize immigrants because if they've had wonderful experience with hard-working immigrants? I'll give you another story. Lot next to the church. It's full of garbage. African-American woman that I know from the neighborhood association sees a number of homeless people lying around. Says to me, I'm sick of looking at the garbage in that lot. I've got $50. Could you take my $50 and maybe hire a bunch of these homeless people to pick up the garbage? And I said, don't waste your money. Why? Because it's not going to happen. Now, there might be a couple of individuals, if I'd know them well, that I'd say, there's a good bet that for the money they would pick up that garbage. But many of the individuals I know, $50 isn't going to do it. $100 isn't going to do it. $1,000 isn't going to do it. What's happened to them by virtue of a system is that they have been disabled by the system. I've seen this many times where individuals who have certain what we would call mental illness qualities, if they were living in a small time, in a different time and place, that small quality probably at a young age could have been dealt with. They would have gotten used to working hard on a farm, and they would have learned the value of work, and the community would have come around them to enable them. Tell you another story. There was an adult in the church I grew up with who had a fairly high mental illness disability. In that day, he would have been called mentally retarded. But he grew up in a Christian family in sort of a Christian village-ish in the middle of a major metropolitan area. And from a young age, he was sent to probably a friend of the family who had a bakery. And the first job I had in high school was cleaning up in a bakery. Well, this individual was basically got a job in this bakery. And even though they had a number of areas that weren't exactly right as a mental illness, basically by virtue of the people around them, again, there was no system or no program that addressed this individual. What there was a community. And this actually gets into the village idea that Scott Adams will talk about later. And this person worked all their life, not on some government program, earning wages because from a very young age they were able to work. Now there are people with disabilities that cannot meet that standard. But what has happened in our society is that a great many other people have been disabled by the system. We could call that systemic disability. And that very well-intentioned woman, there was another day. Our church was renting to a pastor, happened to be a pastor of a black church. And that pastor, who was rather a con man, when he gave us our last check, he promptly canceled payment on the check when he left the church. When he stopped leasing from us. But anyway, this pastor had the habit of bragging about all of the skills in his church. And pastor, you don't have to worry about the landscaping around here. I'll have my people take care of it. And so one day I get to church, and who does he have? He has the bipolar, multiple drug user, and the unmedicated schizophrenic trying to do landscaping here at the church. I didn't say anything. I just watched, and a little part of me enjoyed the show because he figured he would buy these guys cheap and he would get that job done. No, neither of these guys can do that work. Now, actually, I'll tell you, because I know these men well, what work they could do and what work I could pay them to do and they would accomplish it. But with both individuals, it's within a very narrow band. Okay? And I only know that because I know them personally. There's a lot of naivete and a lot of our remedial systems. And in many cases, personal knowledge is really what you need, not some systemic approach. Now, where this really gets interesting with Scott Adams is right here, because part of what I notice when he talks is he tends to talk a certain way with certain terms. And this is a great example of it.
That's a combination of two factors in addition to the baseline racism that is, a problem. And the two other factors are there was a video that probably is misleading, but nobody will ever believe it. That's the first thing. Videos are all lies.
Okay. A video that is probably misleading, but no one will ever believe it. That's a fairly accurate statement. Then he goes on to double down. Videos are all lies. And he tends to like to talk this way. Now, this is Scott Adams. Remember how you notice how he talks about Trump? That Trump is a master of hypnotism and images and rhetoric. And in many ways, Trump is a master of rhetoric, of speaking to particular people. Now, you might look at this and say, well, I thought Obama was far more persuasive. Well, I'll tell you, if you have a college education, you probably do, because Obama spoke your language. He sounded professorial all the time. Trump, who does Trump know how to talk to? How does Trump talk? And when you hear Scott Adams say, videotapes are all lies, that's very Trumpish. Why? Well, does he really mean lies? Because actually, what's a lie? We all know what the word lie means. Intentionally false statement. Does the videographer intend to lie? Probably not. What the videographer is doing is selecting, and Scott Adams is exactly right, and this has been pointed out many, many times. The process of selection edits, and intentionality, whether it's felt to be intentional, well, if the individual isn't doing it intentionally, what system is expressing the intentionality through that person? Well, we call them non-player characters. What does that mean? It means that the system is speaking through the person. And basically what we've got right now in North America are different competing systems speaking through the person. And this in many ways leads to a meaning crisis. And I can ask myself, what system is now speaking through me? Is there actually a Paul Vanderklay here at all? Or is the intentionality that you are seeing practiced by Paul Vanderklay actually the intentionality of a principality and power? Okay, let's have a little fun because I'm a Christian minister. Let's open the Bible and read Ephesians 6. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. What does that mean? How can you be strong in his power? Put on the full armor of God. Obviously, he's working a metaphor here. So that you can stand against the devil's schemes. And in a sense, what we have here is we have, sort of two competing systems that are working through us. Okay? For our struggle is not against flesh and blood. What is Paul saying here? Well, he's basically saying that in many ways, we're all sort of non-player characters. If you're seeing someone with flesh and blood, well, they're a non-player character. Well, what does that mean? Do I sound like Sam Harris? Do I sound like Scott Adams? Because in many ways, this is a lot of what Scott Adams is saying. That, here you have these systems, and these systems are manifesting... These systems are manifesting... These systems are manifesting themselves through us. Now, this isn't wholly different from what Sam Harris has to say. This isn't wholly different from what Scott Adams has to say. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers and against authorities, against powers in this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. What was the Apostle Paul saying? That there are these systems, and these systems work through us, and these systems have intentionality. Now, some of you have a secularist bias that says, I don't ascribe intentionality to anything higher than human beings wrapped in skin who are breathing in oxygen and breathing out carbon dioxide. And I say, that's simplistic. Because, truth be told, if you listen to just about everyone else, they'll say, well, these systems have intentionality, they have unintended consequences, and that's how we work. Here the Apostle Paul says, our battle is not against flesh and blood, it's not against non-player characters, but against rulers, against authorities, against powers in this dark world, and against spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. He's saying that, well, is it a lot different from Carl Jung saying people don't have ideas, ideas have people? Why is it that everyone's lining up on one side or another? Why is it that the noises people make are predictable based on the kinds of things that they're doing? Scott Adams is no dummy. And what Scott Adams is basically doing is saying, well, there's a hierarchy of people who are paying attention. Scott Adams' entire channel is really devoted to unmasking the intentionality of systems. The only question I really have about Scott Adams is the same question I have about Zizek after his conversation with Jordan Peterson. In a sense, Scott Adams is perhaps a cipher for the meaning crisis, because Scott Adams wants to sort of stand apart from it all and say, it's all hypnotism, it's all systems, that's all there is, it's all filters, it's all multiple movies on multiple screens, and in order to get what you want, if you're a little bit better at this game than most people, you can hypnotize and find your way. But what this doesn't answer is, what is a human being? What is at the heart of you? And so Scott is always playing these tricks. And again, I find Scott Adams very helpful. His mastery of systems is what makes his videos masterful and illuminating in very many ways. But at some point you have to ask, Scott, what exactly are you? And I don't know, I'd love to hear him answer this question, but I'd love to hear, well, I am a wanter. You're a wanter? Yes, you are a wanter. What do you want? You want everything. And in many ways, that puts us right back to Augustine. Because what Augustine says is, our hearts are restless, Lord, until we find our rest in Thee. Well, if you understand what we're really grasping at with what we mean by God, well, we do want everything. But we don't want the surface everythings. We want the heart of everything. So, will there be a solid system for Scott Adams to stand on? Or maybe he just has FU money, so he doesn't care. And maybe his job is, if you listen to him, you can have more money too. You can outcompete the rest of the non-player characters. But be careful with that line. Because in many ways, modernist humanism is sort of hanging by a thread. And our moral systems are built on these things. And the more we begin to imagine that, we can see through the systems. We can see above the systems. People themselves are non-player characters within the systems. The more we tend to use people and not love them. So, what's Scott Adams' game? He'll tell you exactly what his game is. But be careful, because he's playing his game as he tells you. And again, I don't say this really as a critic. I am critiquing. I just don't know where and what he's for, besides getting what he wants, which is, again, if you listen to him, he'll tell you, this is how to get what you want. All right? So is there systemic racism? I think Scott Adams, in asking the question, just continues his troll. And troll in terms of, he's not really out to smash you or anything like that. I don't get the sense that Scott Adams is really malicious in any of this. He's just having fun. And he's pulling this thing through the water and seeing what kinds of things, what kinds of fish will follow the shiny lure as it goes through. And again, I learn stuff from him when I watch his channel. But the question is, what's at the heart of him? I don't know.